U.S. still pressures Canada to buy E-7 Wedgetail airborne radars during tariff talks despite GlobalEye selection. The United States was still pressing Canada to buy U.S.-made airborne early warning aircraft as part of a wider trade negotiation, directly challenging Ottawa's selection of Saab GlobalEye before the signature of a binding acquisition contract. Washington's trade demands are unusually specific. Canada should complete its planned purchase of 88 F-35A fighters, acquire U.S. technology including airborne radar aircraft as part of participation in Donald Trump's Golden Dome defense architecture, give the United States a right of first refusal on Canadian critical minerals, and provide guarantees concerning future Canadian oil and gas supplies. In the Canadian EWC competition, the most obvious U.S. aircraft affected by that demand is Boeing's E-7 Wedgetail, which competed against Saab GlobalEye and L-3 Harris Ares X before Saab was chosen as preferred supplier on May 27, 2026. Canada is currently examining a fleet of roughly 5 to 6 GlobalEyes built around the Bombardier Global 6500 manufactured in the country. Ottawa's May decision did not constitute a purchase commitment, which means Washington is applying pressure while the aircraft choice can still be altered without canceling a signed production contract. Washington is creating a substantial leverage as the airborne early warning aircraft procurement is now included in trade negotiations over tariffs affecting several of Canada's largest industrial sectors. Ottawa is attempting to conclude a first-stage agreement before August 19th, when another threatened round of U.S. measures was due to take effect. The package under negotiation could lower existing U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, cars, and forest products and prevent additional tariffs, but it would not necessarily eliminate all of the measures already imposed. Canada was considering removing retaliatory tariffs on U.S. cars, accepting Washington's interpretation of dairy quota allocation, and ending provincial buy Canadian programs and alcohol boycotts. The economic exposure is larger than the AWC program itself because the confrontation has also reached electronics, dairy, alcohol, and other Canadian goods. That creates a direct negotiating logic. Ottawa could concede on a relatively small number of high-value defense procurements, critical mineral access, or future energy commitments if the result is lower tariff rates across industries employing tens of thousands of Canadian workers. The airborne radar issue is therefore being treated as bargaining capital inside a bilateral economic negotiation, rather than as a stand-alone Royal Canadian Air Force acquisition. The significance for Boeing is equally clear. If Ottawa changes course, the United States would not merely gain an allied E-7 operator, but would also reverse one of Canada's most visible recent decisions to shift major defense work toward a Canadian-European industrial structure. Canada's operational requirement is also unusual because Ottawa is not replacing a national AWACS fleet. Canada has never maintained a dedicated fleet of large airborne early warning and control aircraft comparable to the U.S. Air Force E-3 Sentry Force or NATO's multinational E-3A component, and has instead relied on NORAD, U.S. assets and NATO aircraft for much of the airborne radar and battle management function. The E-3 illustrates the scale of that mission. Boeing produced 68 aircraft between 1977 and 1992, based on the 707 airliner for the United States, NATO, the United Kingdom, France, and Saudi Arabia. It's an APY-1 or and APY-2 radar is carried in a 9.1 m diameter rotodome and can detect low-flying targets at more than 400 kilometers and aircraft at medium or high altitude at roughly 650 kilometers. USAF and NATO variants can remain airborne for more than 8 hours without refueling, while later CFM56-powered aircraft reach roughly 11 hours and more than 9,250 kilometers. The personnel burden is also substantial. An E-3 normally carries a 4-person flight crew and 13 to 19 mission specialists, with 14 consoles used for surveillance, identification, fighter control, weapons control, communications, and battle management. A Canadian fleet of only 5 or 6 aircraft therefore implies the creation of a complete national enterprise, including mission crews, fighter controllers, instructors, maintenance personnel, simulator capacity, software support, spare parts, aircrew conversion training, operational doctrine, and enough aircraft availability to sustain NORAD and national tasking over very large distances. The GlobalEye was attractive to Ottawa because it combines that new military capability with a Canadian airframe and a domestic support structure. The Bombardier Global 6500 is considerably smaller than a Boeing 737 and uses a business jet architecture rather than an airliner-based configuration, while Saab AREI active electronically scanned array is installed in a fixed dorsal structure above the fuselage. Canada's Defence Investment Agency selected Saab as preferred supplier on May 27, 2026, specifically linking the project to Bombardier production, Canadian missionization, technology integration, workforce development, and participation by domestic aerospace companies. Saab's proposal has been associated with more than 3,000 Canadian jobs and with maintenance, upgrades, and integration work extending beyond the initial aircraft delivery. This is important because a modern AWC aircraft is not a fixed capability purchased once and operated unchanged for 30 years. Radar processing software, electronic support libraries, communications, Link 16 or successor data links, cryptography, mission computers, satellite communications, and threat databases require repeated modification, and whoever controls the software baseline and engineering authority controls a large share of the fleet's future cost and availability. The GlobalEye would allow Canada to keep the underlying aircraft inside Bombardier's domestic support network while obtaining the sensor and mission architecture from Sweden. That arrangement fits Ottawa's broader 2026 procurement policy, which gives greater weight to domestic production, sovereign sustainment, and foreign partnerships that place industrial activity in Canada. The Bombardier element is especially important because the company had already become a direct target of U.S. economic pressure earlier in 2026. On January 29th, Trump accused Canada of improperly delaying certification of Gulfstream's G500, G600, G700, and G800 business jets and threatened to restrict certification of new Canadian-built aircraft in the United States. He also threatened a 50% tariff on Canadian aircraft until Canada approved the Gulfstream models. Bombardier was the company most directly exposed because its global family competes with Gulfstream in the long-range business jet market, including the Global 7500 against Gulfstream's G700 and G800. The financial impact was immediate. Bombardier shares fell roughly 9 at the following market opening and closed the session about 7 lower, while at least one planned aircraft transaction into the United States was paused because of uncertainty over whether the measures would be implemented. Canada subsequently certified the G700 and G800 on February 23 after certification of the earlier Gulfstream models, although the sequence does not demonstrate that Transport Canada modified its airworthiness standards because of political pressure. The relevance to the AWC decision is direct. The Global 6500 at the center of Canada's preferred military solution comes from the same Bombardier product family that Washington had threatened only months earlier. U.S. pressure over the radar aircraft purchase therefore affects both Saab's defense business and a Canadian aerospace manufacturer that had already been exposed to U.S. tariff and certification leverage. The E-7 offers Canada a larger aircraft, a larger mission cabin, and a longer operational record than GlobalEye, but it would also create a different dependency structure. The Wedgetail is based on the Boeing 737 next-generation family and carries Northrop Grumman's multi-role electronically scanned array, or MESA, in a fixed dorsal structure. 2 broadside arrays each cover roughly 120 degrees, while fore and aft arrays cover roughly 60 degrees, producing 360-degree surveillance without rotating the radar mechanically. The radar can detect targets beyond 600 kilometers in lookup conditions, while the aircraft's electronic support and ELINT functions can exceed 850 kilometers from roughly 30,000 feet. The E-7 can conduct air search, maritime search, fighter control, and area surveillance simultaneously, and the Australian configuration uses 10 operator consoles, with cabin space allowing additional stations. Its endurance has also been demonstrated under operational conditions rather than only during tests. Royal Australian Air Force crews routinely conduct missions of roughly 13 hours, and one November 2015 combat sortie lasted 17 hours and 6 minutes, using 2 aerial refuelings. Australia acquired 6 Wedgetails, Turkey 4 and South Korea 4, while the United Kingdom reduced its planned fleet from 5 aircraft to 3. For Canada, the main operational advantage would be access to a mature Boeing Northrop Grumman system with a larger established operator community, while the main industrial cost would be moving away from a Canadian-built Bombardier airframe and toward, again, a U.S.-controlled aircraft and mission system supply chain. The Allied market also shows why interoperability alone does not settle the Canadian competition. The United Kingdom selected the E-7 in March 2019 under a contract worth roughly $1.98 billion, initially covering 5 aircraft before the fleet was reduced to 3. France chose the opposite approach in December 2025, ordering 2 Saab GlobalEyes with options for 2 additional aircraft and deliveries planned between 2029 and 2032. NATO has also moved toward the GlobalEye as the successor to its E-3A fleet, which is expected to remain in service into roughly 2035. South Korea provides an even clearer example because it already operates 4 E-7s but selected an L-3 Harris and Yeltie Gulfstream-based AWC solution for 4 additional aircraft in 2025 rather than buying a second Wedgetail batch. The result is an Allied AWC structure split among Boeing 737-based E-7s, Bombardier-based GlobalEyes, and Gulfstream-based systems. What matters for coalition operations is therefore not that every country flies the same aircraft, but that the aircraft can exchange tracks, identification data, tasking, and fighter control information through compatible data links, communication standards, and command networks. For Canada, that means E-7 commonality with Australia, Britain, Turkey, and South Korea has operational value, but France and NATO's GlobalEye decisions demonstrate that a Saab choice does not prevent integration into the same NATO and NORAD architecture. The Canadian selection consequently focused on a broader set of variables: radar and electronic support performance, endurance, crew requirements, aircraft availability, cost per flying hour, upgrade rights, industrial workshare, software access, and where depot-level maintenance will be performed. The critical mineral demand is potentially more consequential than the 5 or 6 aircraft AWC purchase because it would alter a defense-industrial relationship that has existed for 85 years. The 1941 Hyde Park Declaration coordinated Canadian and U.S. wartime production, while the 1956 Defense Production Sharing Agreement institutionalized cross-border defense procurement. Under later Defense Production Act arrangements, Canadian companies can be treated as domestic sources for specific U.S. industrial base purposes, allowing Washington to finance production capacity in Canada. The United States has already used those authorities to provide nearly $15 million for copper, gold, graphite, and cobalt projects in Quebec and the Northwest Territories. Fortune Minerals had already spent roughly $137 million on preparatory work for its Nico Cobalt Gold Bismuth Copper project and associated processing facilities before receiving additional U.S. support. Lomico Metals, developing a major graphite deposit in Quebec, obtained public funding covering roughly half of the feasibility and permitting work required before a construction decision. These mechanisms already give Washington unusually deep access to Canadian industrial capacity, but they do not create a standing federal right of first refusal over Canadian minerals. Such a right could give the United States priority access before European or Asian buyers and would therefore represent a stronger form of strategic resource preference than the existing defense production relationship. The fact that this demand is being negotiated alongside the F-35, Golden Dome, and airborne radar aircraft shows that Washington is attempting to link industrial capacity, resource security, allied country-s independence, and military procurement inside the same bilateral framework. The long-term Canadian choice therefore concerns control of an entire military support ecosystem, not simply the radar range of one aircraft against another. A 5 or 6 aircraft fleet could remain in service for 30 years or more, and over that period the larger costs will include radar modernization, mission computer replacement, communications upgrades, software certification, cryptographic equipment, electronic support libraries, engines, structural inspections, simulators, spares, and depot-level maintenance. The GlobalEye would keep the Bombardier airframe inside Canada's aerospace sector and connect Ottawa with France and NATO as users of the same Saab AWC family. The E-7 would align Canada with Trump's views and with Australia, the United Kingdom, Turkey, and South Korea, at the cost of increasing the proportion of the Canadian Air Force controlled through U.S. industrial and software channels. The Golden Dome makes that distinction even more important because Canadian AWC aircraft could therefore be required to exchange high-rate track data with F-35s, NORAD command centers, ground-based radars, space sensors, and future missile defense interceptors. Washington, therefore, has a clear incentive to maximize common U.S. hardware, software, and communications interfaces across Canada's contribution to continental defense. Ottawa has a different incentive: preserve a Canadian-made airframe, retain more modification and maintenance activity domestically, diversify suppliers, and avoid placing another major fleet under the same U.S. industrial dependence already created by the F-35. The current dispute is therefore a concrete test of whether Canada will accept deeper U.S.-controlled integration in exchange for trade relief and defense commonality, or continue shifting selected procurements toward arrangements that retain more industrial work, strategic independence, and technical authority inside Canada.